All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to discuss introducing young new shooters to the shooting sports. Now, with that, we need to go ahead and kind of cover a few concepts, a couple of ideas. So if I'm taking too long through this particular portion, you kind of want to get to the nitty-gritty bits of the video, go ahead and check the description. I'll have chapters laid out there. However, first off, an idea that I want to get across to you guys is I am in no way accredited in child development or anything along those ways. So the stuff that we're going to cover here today is entirely my observations over years of teaching, training, and working with adults who maybe didn't necessarily get the best introduction into firearms. And on that subject, some of us grew up with firearms. Some of us grew up with an interest in firearms. Their family shot, they hunted, they did things with firearms on a relatively regular basis. Others in the Second Amendment community would not discover firearms until they were already adults. Perhaps they joined the military and that increased an interest in firearms, or they just decided, at some point that they wanted to take more responsibility for their own defense. Perhaps they had friends who shoot and they decided they wanted to hop in with them. It doesn't matter. Regardless, I've already done a video talking about introducing more of the adult category of new shooter. This, we're really going to focus in on introducing kids, because there's a lot of things we got to take into account whenever it is that we introduce kids into the shooting sports. And one of the biggest things that I want to address here is that we do not necessarily want to extend bad habits, be that in firearms handling or marksmanship fundamentals. Now, I have always had an interest in firearms, in history and little facts and tidbits about them and all that kind of stuff, ever since I was very small. My dad owned guns, but he didn't really shoot a whole lot when I was very small. I wouldn't really get into the shooting sports until I was in my preteen era. That was when we as a family started going shooting and all those types of things. Whenever I wanted to see the guns, they were brought out to me so that they were not necessarily a taboo subject or anything along those lines. I would sit down on the couch, Dad would bring the guns out, I would look at them, ooh and ah, and then they'd go back to where they were. I knew where the guns were, but my introduction to firearms would occur a little bit later on. And I would say that while I enjoyed shooting when I was a kid and all those types of things, I did not necessarily get the best instruction. And that was because my dad was not necessarily the best instructor. And it's not any fault of his own. He was raised how to shoot. He was raised and taught how to shoot from his father, who was taught from his father, and so on and so forth. And there were a lot of not very strong habits that were introduced, or not very good habits that were introduced along the way. So, for instance, whenever we would shoot rifles, the only guns that actually got zeroed were guns with rifle scopes. Everything else, if it was iron sights, we just Kentucky windaged everything. Everything was out of the box, sighted how it was, however it is that it came from the factory. So we would just do holdovers or hold unders or whatever. And I was not really taught rifle marksmanship fundamentals up until I started carrying a gun for a living. Same with handguns. I knew how to operate handguns. I knew all the ins and outs of unloading and disassembly and all that kind of stuff. But as far as actual handgun marksmanship, I had zero experience, especially because anyone that I had who could have taught me didn't necessarily know how to diagnose issues. It was a lot more discussion of oh, you're hitting low? Well then, what would be a really fast sight picture to acquire would be to put your front sight on top of your rear sight, and then you won't shoot low anymore. Well, that's just Kentucky windaging the handgun where it's supposed to go. It's not actually addressing the core issue of a flinch or recoil anticipation or any of those types of things. So in a lot of ways, I had to kind of teach myself how to shoot, which was not, generally, whenever somebody has to teach, when someone is self-taught, it's going to wind up kind of backfiring. They're not going to get the best practices. It is important as a part of training that your self-instruction is at some point vetted by somebody else, that you have to display it in front of somebody who is knowledgeable, who can then make adjustments in order to be able to better focus your self-training. I'm not saying don't be self-taught. I am saying that you have to be outside examined at some point in order to make sure that you're actually building the proficiency that you think you're building. And in general, the vast majority of people in the Second Amendment community have a very inflated sense of their capability with a firearm. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about how we should go about introducing kids to guns. And a lot of people ask about what age and all that kind of stuff. I think there's two ages that we need to discuss. One is the age of cognition. So the kid is mobile, communicative, and is able to reason. So they're at a point of understanding. You can start teaching them right from wrong. You can start teaching them action and reaction and all those types of things. They may not necessarily be at the level where they could actually handle like a recoil and the operation of a firearm and holding it and all that kind of stuff. This is probably still a fairly young age. And the important thing to get across in this case when you start teaching kids about guns is the safety aspect. We have our 4 firearm safety rules and all that kind of stuff, but the 2 that I think is most important to get across at this age is treat every gun as if it's loaded, and never point a gun at anything that you're not willing to kill. And I emphasize the use of the word kill. A lot of times, whenever people talk about these safety rules, they say don't point a gun at anything that you're not willing to destroy. I don't think destroy adequately captures what it is that we're trying to get across to somebody. Destroy is surprisingly, in this case, kind of a soft euphemism in comparison to kill. We need to get across to kids that these items are not necessarily inherently dangerous, but they can be if they are not respected. And we have to teach them what respect for a firearm looks like. Treat it as if it's loaded. Never point a gun at anything that you're not willing to kill. Now, when I was a kid, I had free access to the guns. Like once we hit a certain point, when my dad really started buying a lot of guns and stuff like that, the closet in my bedroom in his house had all the guns in it. All the guns, all the ammunition. There were stacks upon stacks of rifle cases and toolboxes full of handguns and all that kind of stuff. I could walk in there whenever I want. There wasn't even a doorknob on the door. It'd been removed years prior and never replaced. It never got replaced the entire time he was in that house. So going around that place, like I could just grab guns whenever it is that I wanted. And I never necessarily injured anybody. I didn't go on a shooting spree or any of those types of things. However, one time a friend of mine came over and my dad's Ruger Super Red Hawk was sitting out. And this kid grabbed that gun, pointed it at me, and pulled the trigger. Now, I knew that gun was unloaded, but he didn't know that gun was unloaded. He assumed it was unloaded and decided to test that by pointing it at another human being and squeezing the trigger. And that was a Ruger Red Hawk, a Super Red Hawk. It was chambered in .454 Casull. You would have been cleaning me off the wall for weeks had that gun been loaded. That's why I think it's important to get these safety principles up front, right off the bat. Because say you make a slip up in your storage. We're not necessarily going to get really heavy into storage because it's a very individual thing, but it is important that you store your firearms in a manner that they are not necessarily easily accessible to your child. Because of an instance that a friend comes over and gets a hold of a firearm that does happen to be loaded because you made an oops, perhaps, or maybe somebody got into something that they shouldn't have gotten into, they've been playing with it, and then you wind up with a dead kid, be it the friend or your own child, doesn't matter. There are lots of instances of accidental discharges from children killing other kids or even adults. We need to make sure that we fix that as much as we can, and it starts with education. Not making firearms a taboo subject and making sure that proper safety handling is always conducted, or proper safe handling is always conducted. And I have trouble with words today. Obviously, I need a little more whiskey to smooth things out, right? So, you get your kids into a stable position with that, and you are going to set yourself up for success later. Even if they don't have an interest in firearms, they're still going to be around firearms. They need to know how to handle them safely. And the idea here is not to make kids afraid of guns. We want to steward the Second Amendment to the next generation. We want to make sure that it continues to live past us because we have Americans that are avid in participation in the Second Amendment. And even if they don't participate in it, they're at least not opposed to it because they understand that the safety aspect of it and that guns are not inherently dangerous and all those types of things. But they still have to have the respect that is associated with what a firearm can do if it is mistreated. So then, Murph, when do we start introducing shooting fundamentals and all those types of things? That's a more difficult question to answer, and it's one that has to be seriously considered by you, the parent. Do I think that my kid is in a position where they are responsible enough, where they demonstrated safe handling principles around firearms that are already in the home? Have they demonstrated the maturity necessary to be able to operate and function a firearm without necessarily causing an issue? We don't want to get into a situation where we have a kid up on the firing line and they sweep the firing line with their finger on the trigger. We have adults do that and we wouldn't accept it. It has to be just as unacceptable with a child. And if they cannot display, if you're not comfortable that they have that displayed understanding, then it's not yet time to introduce them to firearms. As in taking them out on the range and having them shoot something that's actually being explosively propelled downrange. But there is a way that you can check this type of stuff without having to pull out live ammunition, and that's with BB guns, be it airsoft or actual metallic BB guns. That is a great opportunity to not just be able to display safe firearms practices, but also be able to start introducing the concept of shooting fundamentals, trigger manipulation, sight picture, all those types of things. You can do so with something that you could shoot in the backyard and not necessarily harm anything as long as you know your backstops and all those types of things. You can start to introduce the concept of know your target and beyond. Keep your figure straight until you're ready to fire. All those kinds of things. You can get the rest. You now have all of the firearms handling safety rules represented in one location with something that is a lower threat than taking a 22 or something along those lines. Now, something else that's important to remember, guys, do not advance your kid through shooting too fast. Johnny's first trip out to the range is not the time to break out the M1 Garand. Okay? It's not funny to hand your kid a 10 gauge and watch him get thrown across the room by the recoil. Like that's not funny. And actually, if anything, it's creating a possibility that kid's not going to want to come back to shooting. And that's not what it is that we're trying to achieve here. Now, this segues us into another really kind of important wrapping up thoughts here. First off, it's okay for your kid to not be interested in shooting. If they have no interest in shooting, then you don't necessarily need to force those interests on them. When I was a kid growing up, my father and brother were really into like working on cars and all that kind of stuff and lawnmowers and like doing a lot of very mechanical things. And I had no interest, so I did not partake. And my dad always construed my lack of interest for lack of ability. Now, as it would turn out, I actually have a lot of mechanical ability. I have latent mechanical ability. I just don't necessarily display it all that often. He was very surprised to learn this. So when it comes to working on my car and stuff like that, I can work on my car, and I have swapped out relatively major parts and all that kind of stuff, generally with the help of a friend who knows what it is that he's doing, but I know how to operate tools. I know how to be able to work in a space and all those types of things. I choose not to do some things because I either don't have the tools or don't have the time, whichever it is that it may be. But there are plenty of things that I'm willing to fix on my vehicle before I would take it to a mechanic. Installing triggers and guns and all that type of thing. Same overall option. Building AR-15s. Like I have mechanical interest. I don't necessarily indulge in it all that often. Your kid might later on decide, you know what, actually I would really like to get into firearms. I would really like to get into shooting. All my friends shoot, or, I had a situation arise where now I'm more interested in perhaps engaging in the Second Amendment activity. Now, in addition to that, an important gut check is to recognize your own ability. Not everyone's a firearms expert. Not everyone's a master marksman. What's really important is to recognize that about yourself, and I would implore you to go to a course, to go get some quality instruction, be teachable in order to be able to teach somebody else. Through my day job, I have gotten access to a lot of courses. I've done a lot of like instructor level courses and stuff like that, and have the opportunity to be able to teach in addition to being an expert in my field to begin with. I spent a lot of time training people. One of the biggest things I have run into over the years is untraining bad habits, be it because somebody was self-taught or because they received poor instruction to begin with. My intent here in this video is to address the idea that you want your child to be as proficient as they can be with good habits, be it safety and marksmanship fundamentals. So make sure that you invest the time and set aside your own ego to go and get that training. It only benefits everybody involved to do so. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. Hope you guys found this interesting. That's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.
Good job!
Weapon on safe, watch your muzzle. Point it down at the ground. All right, good job!
Yo, hold on, wait, I gotta set this down.
Okay.